At the very end of Super Metroid, right before the credits fade out, there appears a phrase that has puzzled many Metroid fans, that is, at least some Metroid fans, well okay, mostly me, for quite some time. Produced by Deer Force of Team Shikamaru. When I first saw these words interrupting Samus's farewell to the player, the last thing you see before the item percentage and see you next mission, I was totally flummoxed. Where did this come from? What is the Deer Force? What is Team Shikamaru? The game has just spent a couple of minutes telling you the names of all the people who worked on it, all presumably Nintendo employees, and right at the end it says, nah, Nintendo didn't make this, you dummy. It was the famous Japanese game studio Deer Force. As it turns out, though, there really is a Deer Force. It was a code name given to a group of programmers working at Intelligent Systems, one of Nintendo's oldest game development partners, and one of the few to still be independently owned and operated after more than 4 decades of working for a single ginormous customer. I first heard of these guys from their association with the Paper Mario series, which they created at Nintendo's request, and have been responsible for throughout its 25-year history. But they're also the developers of Pushmo, Advance Wars, every WarioWare game after the first one, and if you go back far enough, half of the launch titles for the Game Boy, half of the launch titles for the NES, and, curiously enough, Metroid. Don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying Nintendo R&D 1 didn't make Metroid, because they did. Or at least they designed it. What Intelligent Systems took care of was the programming, actually implementing the ideas dreamed up by R&D 1 employees, like Hiroji Kiyotake and Yoshio Sakamoto. In that sense, they're a lot like HAL Laboratory, which also got its first big boost helping to develop launch titles for the Famicom. HAL just happened to develop its own reputation and spread its wings a lot faster. If you were wondering a few videos ago why so little is known about Metroid's original programmers, this is part of the reason. Those programmers didn't work for Nintendo at all. They worked for Team Shikamaru, which is to say for Intelligent Systems, as part of a close partnership with Nintendo. As perennial second bananas, they had much less of an opportunity to develop a reputation than Nintendo's people did. That lone credit at the end of Super Metroid is the only kudos I've ever seen them receive, although they worked on literally dozens of games before then. What makes this all even more confusing is that there's also a team of people inside Nintendo, which is sometimes referred to as Team Shikamaru, although this group is much smaller. It consists of Super Metroid's director, Yoshio Sakamoto, its producer, Makoto Kano, and object designer Toru Osawa, whose biggest claim to fame is inventing the Kid Icarus series. These three obviously aren't responsible for all the cool ideas found in Super Metroid, but it was their guidance that saw the project through to the end. Osawa was sort of the Takashi Tezuka of this group. He had a knack for little design changes that make things more fun and interesting. He's officially credited with designing most of the smaller enemies, as well as Kraid, Mother Brain, and crucially, the appearance of the map and inventory screens. Yoshio Sakamoto was even more clearly the Miyamoto of Metroid, the big idea guy who always wanted to do more than the hardware could actually manage. He once claimed that Gunpei Yokoi didn't want his designers to understand the technology of Nintendo's consoles, because if they did, they'd be intimidated out of pushing technical boundaries. If that's true, then Sakamoto was his champion. He's the artsiest and least nuts and bolts guy who ever worked on Metroid games, and unsurprisingly, he's often been the one in charge of writing their stories, beginning in 1994 with Super Metroid. And Makoto Kano doesn't really have an analog on the Mario team. If I were to compare him to anybody else, it wouldn't be someone at Nintendo at all, but rather the oddly similarly named Masato Kato of Squaresoft, who wrote the stories for Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, and Xenogears. Kano was a quiet guy who liked creating strange virtual worlds and dabbled in art on the side. Super Metroid is actually the last game in his resume on which he's credited for anything other than art. According to Sakamoto, Kano was the reason this game got made in the first place, but his contribution to it is a nebulous one that's hard to pin down. With these three in charge, and a dozen or so artists and programmers pulled from R&D 1 and Intelligent Systems, the sequel to the original Metroid began to take shape. And yes, that's basically what Super Metroid is, not a sequel to Metroid 2, which was a very different kind of game. Metroid 2 took the original experience and stripped it down to the essentials, enhancing its simple foundation with added structure and some clever new abilities for Samus. Super Metroid was, by contrast, a more traditional kind of sequel. It took what was in the original Metroid, made it look and sound better, and added a lot more of everything. Super Metroid begins right at the moment that Metroid 2 ended. We see Samus returning to Galactic Federation HQ with the lone remaining Metroid in tow, an infant which hatched right in front of her immediately after she destroyed the Queen. Unlike every other Metroid she had encountered, it was docile and showed no signs of aggressive tendencies. Instead of attacking, it followed her, like a confused child in her words, and a gut feeling told Samus that she should keep it alive so the Federation could study it. Which, in case you've forgotten after all this time, is what they were originally planning to do before the first space pirate attack. She delivers the infant Metroid to the Ceres research station, where initial tests indicate that the creature is able not only to extract and store vast amounts of energy, but also release it in a variety of forms, which would make it useful even in a peaceful society. It would seem that Metroids can do more than just mindlessly destroy everything around them, which was hinted at in Metroid 2 by the abundance of other forms of life on SR-388. Pleased with the results of her work, Samus leaves the station and is all set to take on a new mission for the Federation when a distress call from Ceres throws all her plans out the window. She hurries back to the station and discovers that it's been ransacked by the space pirates, who've recovered their strength in the months since her assault on Zebes. Dead researchers litter the station's hallways, and when Samus enters the room holding the last Metroid, she finds it in the clutches of the pirates' most fearsome commander, Ridley. A fight ensues, but the unprepared Samus fails to stop Ridley from activating the station's self-destruct function and flying off with the captive Metroid. After narrowly escaping the collapsing station, Samus tracks Ridley back to the place where this all began, Zebes, newly rebuilt to serve the pirates again as a fortress and laboratory. Landing on the planet's surface, she faces unknown dangers on all sides, both natural and artificial. Once again, she must destroy the pirates' base and eliminate the threat of Metroids to ensure galactic peace. But this time, the pirates will be expecting her, and no doubt have put defenses in place specifically to target the famed galactic warrior. In its broad strokes, the plot structure of Super Metroid is remarkably similar to the original Metroid, so much so that it occasionally comes across more as a reimagining than a sequel. Samus makes landfall on Zebes, travels through Brinstar and Noir collecting upgrades, and has to defeat several bosses to unlock the path to Turian, where she blows up a bunch of cloned Metroids and then confronts Mother Brain at the end. For anyone who played the first game, there's an uncanny sense of familiarity to many moments throughout the experience, a feeling that the developers clearly anticipated, since several of these moments rely on your past knowledge of the series to trip you up. Super Metroid has an attitude toward the original game that I can only describe as playful, and it starts playing around with your expectations from the very beginning. The first thing Samus has to do when she leaves her ship is to enter a cavern, which takes her down through a room eerily similar to the one she once climbed up to escape Zebes after destroying Mother Brain. Passing through a door at the bottom, she finds herself in the room that housed Mother Brain, now ruined and in complete disrepair. Stepping over the broken glass and twisted metal, she discovers an elevator which takes her down to a room virtually identical to the starting screen of the original Metroid. This entire time, Zebes has been dead quiet. No living things appear except for strange trilobite-like bugs which live in the walls and scurry away at her approach. It's an even lonelier and more ominous introduction than Metroid 2 had, since in that game there were at least enemies bumping around the tunnels of SR-388. Here there's nothing, no real gameplay at all, and it bottoms out exactly where the first game started. Because every other passageway has been closed off up to this point, you could easily think that Super Metroid's map is going to be almost identical to the first game's, but that would still leave you wondering why there haven't been any enemies yet. Remember that the only combat section so far has been the fight against Ridley, which you can't win no matter what you do. Up to now, you haven't been presented with a single enemy that you can fight in a normal manner. At a loss for what to do, you go on instinct. The morph ball should be hidden to the left of this screen, and yep, it's there all right, but so is something else. As soon as you grab this first upgrade, a security camera shines a spotlight on you, and the statues filling the room start to glow red. That's a little odd, but there's still no enemies, so maybe it's no big deal? You can still go to the right, where there's a room with a destructible floor, just like last time. Only in this case, it doesn't lead to Kraid's lair, just to a bird statue which holds your first missile tank. You can use this to proceed through a missile door and find another missile tank, as well as a second security camera. And that's it. Presumably some kind of cave-in must have happened due to the explosion of the former pirate base, because there are no doors remaining open. But if you've been paying close attention, you might remember that there was a door earlier blocked off by a low tunnel. That's your only lead, so although it seems a bit wrong, you head back up the elevator, which is the moment Super Metroid chooses to hit you with its first big whammy. The Mother Brain room is now full of strange bipedal aliens, both walking around and climbing on the walls. Turns out that security camera meant something after all. It let the space pirates know exactly where you were, and now they're here to take you down. These are Zebesians, later to become the species most strongly associated with the space pirate moniker, and it's worth pointing out that even though the manual does mention them, it doesn't feature a picture of their sprite, or warn you how soon they appear. Whether intentionally or not, but I suspect it was intentional, they're described as appearing in Turian at the end of the game. Remember that before this, ordinary space pirates did not appear on screen in any Metroid game. Kraid, Ridley, and Mother Brain represented the pirates for gameplay purposes, but they're far from ordinary. Kraid is a giant turtle, Ridley is some kind of sci-fi dragon, and Mother Brain is literally a brain in a jar. So one of the biggest mysteries to an ordinary Metroid player in 1994 would have been what space pirates actually look like, and this is how Super Metroid tells you. What I'm getting at is, whether or not you've played a Metroid game before, this moment comes completely out of nowhere and is really disturbing. It's an ambush, and the way the game is designed, you have no choice but to walk right into it. It's in moments like this that we can see the influence that Metroid 2 had on Super Metroid, despite the two games having different design approaches. While the original Metroid could be scary at times, I would never describe it as a horror game, or one designed to freak you out. But Metroid 2 did this all the time, using its tighter structure to herd the player into unexpected and suddenly unavoidable challenges. Super Metroid is a synthesis of these two approaches. It's more open, like the first game, but it fills its open world with tricks and traps that are far more reminiscent of the second, and the resulting tone is frequently pretty creepy and unnerving. After returning to Crateria, the japes continue. Both of the rooms accessible with your new Morph Ball power are dead ends. One is a missile expansion, and another is the first save room. Progressing now requires you to go back up to the surface and find another narrow gap to slide through, which leads to a hallway, and from there to another bird statue, which comes to life when you grab its power-up and tries to kill you. This infamous gotcha boss, usually called Torizo by fans, emerges from the second statue you run across, long before you can get comfortable with the idea that these statues are safe. You know, when Gene Wilder played Willy Wonka in that classic children's movie from the 70s, there's a memorable scene in which his character first appears limping and supporting himself on a cane. He shuffles out to meet the crowd outside his factory, then seems to lose his grip on the cane, staggers, and begins to topple over, only to do a somersault and jump back up with a flourish. In interviews, Wilder pointed out that this scene was his idea, and he insisted on it being included for this reason, because from that moment on, nobody in the audience could ever be sure if he was lying or telling the truth, and that would make the entire rest of the movie more exciting. That is this boss in a nutshell, and it's a spirit that can be found throughout Super Metroid. Just when you think you know what's up, the game throws another curveball at you and forces you to adapt. It's incredibly clever, but I must admit it does make you grit your teeth sometimes. For new players, this is when the rug pulling slows down, and Super Metroid starts to feel more like a classic, exploration-driven Metroidvania, an impression which the game keeps up for several hours, before the shenanigans return in the wrecked ship and especially Meridia, which comes just afterwards. But if you're a seasoned Metroid veteran, the game continues to play with expectations set by its predecessor, particularly with respect to level design. The first game opened up new areas to explore in big chunks, allowing you to get to 80 or 90% of a region as soon as you first set foot in it. Most of Brinstar can be reached with only the Morph Ball, while the distant corners of Noir are generally blocked off by high walls. Since both the high jump boots and Ice Beam are found here, you can see quite a lot of it during your initial visit. Kraid and Ridley's lairs are completely explorable as soon as you reach them, and of course Torian, as the ending of the game, is a straight shot. Because it has more distinct regions, with each taking up a relatively smaller percentage of the map, Super Metroid was bound to involve more travel between its regions than the original game did, but the map designers latched onto that quality and made it even more interconnected than it had to be. Most of the overworld regions, which is to say Brinstar, Norfair, Crateria, and Meridia, connect to at least two other parts of the overworld, as well as a dungeon, like the wrecked ship and Kraid and Ridley's lairs. I call these dungeons because they're smaller and more linear than the other regions, with access to them always being controlled by a single intended entry point. This makes them feel more like The Legend of Zelda's dungeons, instead of the more open maps typically found in a Metroidvania. The original Metroid felt big because in every area rooms just kept stretching on and on. With the exception of Torian, all of its areas were sprawling, which meant that no matter which part of the world you were in, the gameplay would always feel fairly consistent. You wander around collecting missile and health expansions until you stumble on a secret path which leads to a big upgrade, then lather, rinse, and repeat. Super Metroid feels big for a very different reason, because you keep being taken out of the area you're in and brought to an entirely new part of the map, which does feel different to play through. Here's an example of that. After grabbing the super missiles in Brinstar, you quickly run into a warren of muddy tunnels, referred to in the game's official soundtrack as the Red Soil Swamp, or Lower Brinstar. You'll probably realize later on that this area is so inundated with water because it's right next to Meridia, but that revelation is a long way off. For now, you pass through and find an elevator which takes you to Norfair for the first time. Despite its more polished graphics, Noir is probably the area which is most familiar compared to its 8-bit counterpart. It's the land of fiery caverns and rocky tunnels. Unlike Brinstar, it hasn't become a jungle of plant and animal life. You know it when you see it, and a returning Metroid player would naturally expect to have a long session of exploration and upgrade acquiring to look forward to. But that's not what happens. There are lots of hallways branching off from the entryway of Noir, but almost all of them lead to either a dead end or a superheated room which rapidly drains your health, making progress through it nearly impossible. These damaging rooms are a new wrinkle on how progress works in Super Metroid. The original game had damaging hazards, but they were always avoidable. Now if you don't have the upgrade that protects Samus, you have to leave the room completely and try another path. Then the game throws you for another loop by giving you the wrong upgrade. Not a bad one, mind you. Actually, it's one of the best in the game. Just the wrong one for the situation you're in. To go down any of the blocked paths in Noir, you need the Varia suit, which wasn't in Noir originally, but with all the things this game has changed, it wouldn't be unreasonable for them to put it here. Another thing that might help is the Ice Beam, which was originally in Noir, and which would let you climb up the room full of rippers in Lower Brinstar. That would require some backtracking, but it's an obvious bottleneck for the game to unblock next. Instead, you get the High Jump, which doubles Samus's jump height. This is still very early in the game to be given such a huge boost, by the way, compared to most later Metroidvanias. So much of Super Metroid is designed around you having it, that Samus's moveset really doesn't feel complete until this point. But all it's useful for when you get it is to escape the room you found it in. Noir is mostly a series of cramped tunnels, even more so than in the original game. The High Jump would be a hugely useful upgrade anywhere but here. Having spent maybe 10 minutes in Noir, you're now forced to ride the elevator back up to Brinstar, where a little digging will uncover a secret tunnel to Kraid's lair, the smallest subregion in the game, but also one of the more confusing to navigate. Blasting through a few more hidden tunnels takes you to the boss fight with Kraid, and then you get the Varia suit, which opens up the next big part of Noir. So just to recap, in the original Metroid, when you first get to Noir, that's the prelude to spending a lot of time in Noir before moving on. In Super Metroid, your first visit to Noir is practically a red herring. You go on one little excursion to get an upgrade, and then immediately head back to Brinstar, where a new path is opened up. If you charted a player's progress through each game, the 8-bit Noir would be like a big round balloon for players to bounce around to their heart's content. Its 16-bit equivalent would look like a ribbon, snaking through one specific path at a time, and then doubling back to go down a different one. Despite a superficial resemblance to the first game, Super Metroid is a lot less open-ended than it looks, and it has a whole bag of tricks to prevent unwanted exploration, one of the simplest of which is just locking doors behind you when the game doesn't want you to backtrack to earlier areas. When I heard people complaining about the one-way doors in Metroid Dread a few years ago, I had to chuckle, because while there are certainly problems with that game, some of which I've brought up myself, this is one area in which it's following in the footsteps of the acknowledged master of map design. If this is a problem in Dread, it's just as much of a problem in Super Metroid, but I would argue that in both cases, this is a good decision. It forces players to focus their exploration in a certain direction at pivotal moments, which keeps the game from provoking that bewildered, lost feeling that the Metroid series is so often criticized for. If I had to summarize Super Metroid's approach in 2 words, they would be subtle structure. You're never told outright where you need to go, or more importantly, what you're supposed to do to get the next upgrade. The game just nudges you in the right direction with its level design, in so subtle a fashion that it sometimes soars right over players' heads. But when you click with what the game's trying to tell you, it achieves that same elusive sense of fun that's typical of classic Zelda games. It makes you feel really smart. Super Metroid's best asset is how it combines this smart puzzle solving with a much more dynamic world. No previous Nintendo game gives you as much freedom to change how rooms and even entire areas work by using your abilities. That's what makes it more complicated and confusing than either of the previous games, but it's also what makes it more rewarding to engage with. I don't want to just rattle off a litany of all the cool things that can happen in Super Metroid, mostly because that would take hours, and you can enjoy them much more by simply playing it yourself. But this is the game which lets you blow open an underwater tunnel as an alternate entrance to Meridia, and power up a wrecked spaceship to change it from a haunted derelict to a bustling hive of robotic activity, and defeat a boss by grappling into an active power line after it grabs you and electrocuting it to death. You have so many options, in fact, that it comes as quite a surprise to find that the most emotionally intense parts of the game work by taking all your choices away, and making you feel completely powerless, if only for a few moments. The order in which you fight Super Metroid's 4 main bosses is its most linear and highly structured component, helping to divide the experience into what feels like different chapters. Crade signifies the conclusion of the game's introduction, when the difficulty curve ramps up and exploration becomes much more open for the first time. Later on, a very difficult and unsettling encounter with Phantoon marks Samus's return to the surface, a point when you have a choice between revisiting earlier areas to get more power-ups, or moving on through the wrecked ship and Meridia. Dragon is a confusing boss fight that caps off an extremely confusing area, which also happens to be the last freely explorable region in the entire game. Both Ridley's Lair and Turian are quite linear, with only a handful of side paths and optional upgrades in Ridley's Lair, and none at all in Turian. This abandonment of open-ended design in the last hour of Super Metroid isn't an oversight or a mistake, any more than it was when Metroid did it back in 1986. It's done to raise the emotional stakes and remind the player that Samus is on a mission, not a vacation. Ridley is the character who started this whole thing. He's the only boss whose fight has implications for the story, and it's fitting that his lair is the place where the game says, okay, we've had our fun, now pay attention, this is serious. I wouldn't say that Ridley is the hardest boss fight in the game, unless you're underpowered when you go to fight him. But what he is a damage sponge. There's no clever way to beat Ridley. You just have to keep pummeling him with beam shots and missiles as his skin gets redder and redder, making him look more and more like some kind of demon from hell as the fight goes on. All of the bosses in Super Metroid are stressful to fight, even the mini-bosses like Spore Spawn and Crocomire, but Ridley is by far the most stressful. I also find it interesting that both Ridley and Dragon have moves designed to incapacitate Samus rather than simply damaging her. Dragon spits a gluey substance to tie Samus down, and can grab and crush her if you're not careful, while Ridley constantly tries to get Samus in a chokehold and throttle her. Once Ridley has finally succumbed to his injuries, your sense of relief is immediately undercut by a reminder of what he did before you could catch up to him. The capsule from Ceres which once contained the infant Metroid, now lying shattered on the floor, with the Metroid nowhere in sight. Just like before, the space pirates have taken their captive to Turian, to clone it and experiment with ways of turning its destructive powers against their enemies. With Ridley dead, Samus has now unlocked the door leading to Turian, but there's no telling what she'll discover on the other side. Well, as it turns out, Turian isn't all that different from how you remember it. It's got that secret lab aesthetic, pools full of lava, and a bevy of cloned Metroids to be frozen and blown up. It's such a blatant nostalgia trip, and so easy compared with Ridley's Lair, that anyone who's been through the rest of Super Metroid should have their It's a Trap sensors pinging like crazy. And they wouldn't be far wrong. Dropping through a door in the floor of one particular Metroid habitat, Samus finds herself in a room full of sand, inhabited by two enormous side hoppers. No doubt the product of space pirate experimentation, these enemies are totally invulnerable to Samus's attacks, forcing her to run away for the first time since landing on Zebes. Then something that looks quite like a Torizo statue collapses into a pile of dust right in front of her, perhaps having succumbed to the same fate as a collection of desiccated bug bodies in the next room. A third side hopper jumps in to attack Samus, when suddenly it's ambushed by an enormous Metroid, which drains all the life out of it in a matter of seconds. Still hungry, it pounces on Samus and begins to do the same to her. In a game that revolves around acquiring new upgrades and getting stronger, which has some of the coolest and most challenging boss fights seen on a Nintendo console up to this point, this moment of sheer panic is totally dumbfounding. You can't do anything to this Metroid. Heck, you couldn't do anything to the creature it just effortlessly destroyed. The first thought most players would have on seeing this would be either, shoot, I did something wrong back there and this is a game over, or, this is bullshit, what am I supposed to do? Actually, nothing. There's nothing you can do, and what you have to do is nothing. Just before Samus's suit has lost all its power, which is when she would start to wither away like the Metroid's other victims, it stops and lets her go. Then the Metroid starts to utter strange cooing noises and flies away, leaving Samus battered and exhausted, but alive. Later games in the series would establish that organisms have a unique energy signature, which Metroids can recognize. This isn't 100% obvious in the moment, but I believe that given some time to reflect, most players would understand that the Metroid attacked Samus without knowing who she was, and then, in the middle of draining her energy, suddenly realized it. Since any Metroid clone would have no memory of Samus, there's only one conclusion. As odd as it seems, this is the same infant Metroid that she brought to Ceres from SR-388, with its mutated appearance explained by the experimentation, effectively torture when you think about it, performed by the space pirates. The rest of Turian is just one long hallway of anticipation, until you break through a missile door and find a familiar scene waiting for you. The pirates have recreated Mother Brain's room almost exactly, complete with the regenerating Zebetites, which have to be patiently destroyed to gain access to Mother Brain's protective enclosure. What follows is a miniaturized version of the original game's final boss fight, freeze the Rinkas, avoid her shots, and blast that mother open. As expected, however, this is not the true final boss. Mother Brain's powers have been augmented by the pirates. She now possesses a biomechanical body with which she can walk around, and both beam-based and explosive weaponry, stronger than anything Samus has faced yet. Despite how intimidating all this is, the fight can feel a little anticlimactic. Mother Brain's moves are slow and easy to dodge, nothing like the onslaught of attacks from Ridley an hour ago. But you quickly discover that this is just because she's toying with you. After a while, she starts firing rockets from her arms, which are much faster and deadlier, and then unleashes her secret weapon, a rainbow-colored hyper beam which flings Samus against the wall and pummels her with unavoidable damage. This is the second time in a few minutes that Super Metroid has trapped you in a no-win situation, but now Samus is threatened by something without a shred of empathy, something which wants her dead and is in the perfect position to make it happen. As Samus pants in exhaustion on the floor, Mother Brain once again powers up her unstoppable hyper beam. And in swoops the infant Metroid, latching onto Mother Brain's face and absorbing all the energy from the beam. Mother Brain staggers in confusion, but her tiny T-Rex arms are powerless to peel off the invader. Look, I'm not saying she would have had a chance if the arms were a normal size anyway, but they could have tried. I mean, look at those stubby little things. It's ridiculous. Soon the beam is absorbed, and the Metroid begins to drain Mother Brain herself, leaving her a sickly gray color and practically catatonic as it flies off to grab Samus so it can transfer the energy back to her. Unfortunately, Mother Brain is more resilient than she looks. Her color comes back and she stands back up, ready to fight. Samus is covered up entirely by the Metroid's enormous carapace, but the Metroid itself, still fully occupied in transferring energy to Samus, is defenseless. It endures attack after attack, turning a sickly yellow as its body begins to fall apart. And then, as it finally disengages to defend itself, one last shot from the Mother Brain finishes it off. Samus risked her life once to protect this Metroid. Now it's given its life to protect her. Only one bright spot appears in this darkness. Part of the energy transferred to Samus by the Metroid includes the Hyper Beam which Mother Brain used to kill it. It's this weapon which Samus now uses to pummel Mother Brain until she glows bright red and utters one last shriek before almost literally biting the dust. Just like last time, Mother Brain's defeat sets off a self-destruct mechanism, which will blow the pirates' entire base to smithereens, along with most of the planet and, unless she hoofs it, Samus herself. Getting out of this maze-like final section is another real nail-biter. I almost didn't make it on my recent playthrough. But with a little luck and some common sense, you can get Samus back to the planet's surface, where she hops in her ship and flies off just in time to witness Zebes go up in smoke behind her. The ending of Super Metroid was also the beginning of the Metroid team's serious efforts to tell a story that links all these games together. Metroid 2 had only a tenuous connection to the first game story-wise, but Super Metroid brings them together by taking Metroid 2's ending as a jumping-off point and tying it into a pirate-centric plot similar to the originals. Its dramatic and very linear ending sequence would become the axis around which every subsequent Metroid game would pivot, for better or for worse. The Prime Trilogy, for instance, is set immediately after the original Metroid, but its worlds and story concepts are clearly indebted to Super Metroid's themes of Metroid mutation and space pirate science. There's a lot of Super Metroid in the first Metroid Prime game particularly. But it was Metroid Fusion, released on the same day as Prime, that would really take the aftermath of Super Metroid and run with it. Although its story mostly ignores the space pirates, which are presumed to be defunct after the disintegration of planet Zebes. To find a story that both follows up on Super Metroid and features the pirates, we have to look elsewhere. Other M is a perfect example of the negative influence that an obsession with Mother Brain and the baby could have on a potentially interesting plot. That game begins with a lavishly rendered retelling of the infant Metroid's last moments, which takes the taut and suspenseful drama of the original ending and inflates it into showy, overblown melodrama, which should serve as a pretty good sign of what you're in for with the game's own story. Yoshio Sakamoto, who wrote both games, was clearly very proud of that Super Metroid ending, maybe a little too proud to notice that part of what makes it work so well is that it's subtle and simple, with no dialogue or even overt emotional gestures to overcomplicate things. The truth about how most great Metroid games are written is that most of the really exciting moments happen in your head, not on the screen. It's a series that's great at teasing and suggesting things that might be true, not at explicitly laying out for you what really is true. The Prime Trilogy managed to preserve this quality while also providing large amounts of backstory by making sure to keep the plot, what Samus actually does over the course of the game, simple. At least until Corruption. But even that game doesn't embarrass itself by constantly tying its narrative in knots like Other M does. But the bottom line is this. If you're interested in the legacy of Metroid as a game series, how it got to where it is today, you don't have to play the original game from 1986. A lot has changed since then. You can skip Metroid 2 as well, though I wouldn't recommend it. But you have to play Super Metroid to get this series. It is the quintessential Metroid game. In more than 30 years since it first came out, Super Metroid has lost none of its freshness, and it's still the model that new Metroid games, as well as countless other Metroidvanias, have copied and probably will keep on copying. So before we move on, let's look at what exactly it is the designers are so eager to take away from this game. When I said earlier that the designers of Super Metroid put a lot more of everything in it compared to Metroid or Metroid 2, I wasn't kidding. It's not a particularly long game, but it's very dense with enemies, interactable objects, and background details. A big part of the reason it's so replayable is that you're almost certain to miss things on a first playthrough, and only notice them when you're comfortable enough with the game to look past everything in the foreground. So it should come as no surprise that all three of my legacy categories have a full plate with this one, starting with people and places. The most enigmatic character in Super Metroid, and the one whose status as a character is most debatable, is the infant Metroid, who plays such a major role in its conclusion. The tension and ultimately the emotion of the ending hinges on that unanswered question of how much this Metroid really understood and cared about Samus. But the one thing that's unquestionable is that in its final moments it wanted to protect her, and that's a remarkable thing when you consider what Metroids are. Metroid 2's ending hinted at the idea that Metroids might be good for more than mindless destruction, and the opening of Super Metroid explicitly confirms this, but it's the ending that really hits home with the idea that Metroids have the capacity to voluntarily do good, to protect other creatures, and act contrary to their own survival instinct in doing so. The infant Metroid is basically a tragic figure, the last survivor of its species, which is abducted and cruelly operated upon by the pirates to make more weapons of war, only to be found by its mother in a horribly mutated form, and eventually lose its life in a desperate attempt to save hers. With no Metroid Queen to produce more infants, and no living specimens to clone through radiation, the events of Super Metroid close the book on Metroids as a species. They once existed, now they don't. And the same galactic civilization that once feared their existence is going to have to live with their permanent extinction. A lot of people probably don't care about that, but one person who clearly does is Samus. Super Metroid is also the first Metroid game to give Samus an inner monologue, which unavoidably gives her a personality expressed through her choice of words. The Samus that we see here is still quite a stoic individual, as implied by the other games, but she also reveals hints of emotion, surprise at the behavior of the Metroid larva, excitement upon learning of the scientist's discoveries at Ceres, apprehension at the sudden attacks which force her to return. It's pretty thin stuff, to be honest, but it's more than we've ever been told about Samus's inner world before, told from her own point of view as a character. This is more of Nintendo's hinting at story instead of stating it, and it's easy to read your own emotions into Samus when dramatic events like the Ridley fight happen later on. Speaking of Ridley, it would be a stretch to call him a character in this game, but he does play an important role in the plot, which is more than any individual space pirate has done yet. He's described in the manual as having led the assault on Ceres, where he stole the infant Metroid and caused all the trouble that happened subsequently, so fighting him carries a dramatic weight unprecedented in the series. The fact that it's also a fun and challenging fight is really just icing on the cake. Ridley is often seen as Samus's personal nemesis among the space pirates, a cunning and utterly ruthless bully who also happens to be stronger than most beings in the universe. He's the only non-final boss in the Metroid series who has his own Wikipedia page, and it's easy to see why. It's the same reason he keeps getting shoehorned into games where he absolutely does not belong from a narrative standpoint. Because Ridley is just cool, and everybody knows it. Less cool are the Chozo, who, like the Metroids, are also pretty much extinct at this point in the saga. All that's left of them are their statues and the upgrades they contain. Super Metroid proper doesn't have a lot to say about the Chozo. It left that task to the tie-in manga published in Nintendo Power. But this is the first time they were called Chozo, and specifically referred to as bird people, which is actually what Chozo means in Japanese. Kind of. Technically, it's an abbreviation of Chojin Zoku, which means bird people tribe. And funnily enough, it sounds very similar to the real Japanese word Chozo, which means statue. Are we sure Hiroji Kiyotake didn't work on this game? Because this really feels like his sense of humor at work. Finally, we have two groups of animals that are the closest thing mainline Metroid would ever get to friendly NPCs. Edacoons and Dakoras, both found deep in the wilds of Brinstar. The Edacoons are three dangerously cute monkey-like creatures whose call is an in-universe example of Samus's upgrade jingle, suggesting that this might be some kind of Chozo music which they heard once and are mimicking. After singing to you, they leap up the walls one by one in order to teach you how wall jumping works, since this is the only way to get out of the pit where you find the Etecoons. It's a really clever way of conveying a secret move to the player without breaking the fourth wall, one of two to be discovered in Super Metroid. The other is taught to Samus by the Decora, a big-eyed flightless bird which is able to run just as fast as Samus can with her speed booster. By soaring into the air after running around, the Decora teaches you the useful but difficult Shine Spark maneuver, which, like wall jumping, is never required to complete the game, but makes many sections a good deal easier. One of Super Metroid's most beloved secrets involves rescuing the Etecoons and Decora, along with its single egg, from the explosion of Zebes. It requires you to take a brief detour during the ending countdown to blow a hole in a wall so the animals can run out. You even see them flying away at the end, just to show that, yes, they're still alive and kicking. Which brings us to places. Since it takes place on the planet Zebes again, Super Metroid doesn't have any new places to show off broadly speaking, but there are several new regions of the planet to explore. None of them reappeared in future games apart from Zero Mission, but several did have a noticeable influence on the Prime trilogy at least. The planet's surface, Criteria, with its subdued and rainy atmosphere, feels a lot like the Talon overworld from Metroid Prime, complete with a wrecked ship that requires the gravity suit to fully explore. Meridia, the first Metroid level to be set primarily underwater, had equivalents in both of the first two Prime games, and Lower Norfair is a pretty obvious inspiration for Magmoor Caverns. They even use the same music. Before we cover Super Metroid's enemies and upgrades, I ought to let you know that I missed one in the last video. The Shoot Leech, which zooms up and then slowly drifts back down to the surface, shows back up in Super Metroid as one of the aquatic enemies of Meridia. That means it shows up in more than one sequel, so I should have discussed it. It's just that I totally forgot it was here until I replayed Super Metroid. I thought it only came back in Fusion. Super Metroid has an abundance of interesting creatures in its world, whether enemies or just weird animals you run into. But the unfortunate thing from a legacy perspective is that most of these are either unique to Super Metroid, like Crocomire and Dragon, or only show up one other time. Bochwoon, for instance, the mini-boss of Meridia, sort of came back in Metroid Fusion as Ceres, the speed-boosting sea snake which glides underwater in a similar fashion. And Fantoon made an appearance as the surprise final boss of Other M, a game that seems like it was determined to crowbar as many classic Metroid bosses into its last 3 hours as humanly possible, continuity be damned. But for the most part, these really cool creatures are just stuck here, on the only planet in the universe that ended up exploding twice. Super Metroid's main contribution to the series' enemy roster was its introduction of the two main varieties of space pirate. Zebesians come in a variety of colors, most of them gross, and walk and climb around shooting beams at Samus. They look like the brains of the pirate forces, an impression reinforced by their similarity to the bug-like pirates of the Prime series. By contrast, the Key Hunters are definitely the muscle. They look a lot like bees, and as they hover around slashing you with their sickle arms and talons, you just get the impression that they wouldn't get much done in front of a keyboard. When it comes to upgrades, Super Metroid is much more important. It's the second largest contributor of new abilities to the series, outranked only by the original Metroid, and most of its additions became essential not just to the core series, but also to spin-offs like Metroid Prime. Let's start with the Charge Beam, found early on in Brinstar, which allows Samus to charge up her arm cannon and shoot a more powerful beam after a second or two. This is such a common ability in games now that we hardly ever think about it, but in 1994 it was still a novel concept, especially for Nintendo. The first console game to feature it was likely Irem's side-scrolling shoot-'em-up R-Type in 1987, with the concept appearing in a platformer the next year. Mega Man 2 had you hold down the fire button to charge the atomic fire weapon obtained from Heatman. The Mega Buster itself would gain this power in Mega Man 4, which came out in the early 90s, so it's possible Nintendo filched the idea from Capcom, but nobody's admitted to anything. Other new attack options include powered-up versions of Samus's explosive weapons, the Super Missile and Power Bomb, which are used for combat, destroying certain environmental objects, and rationing progress through color-coded doors. More on that later. Power bombs, with their long delay and cooldown, are a little tricky to use effectively in battle, but super missiles come in very handy. Be careful using them in certain boss fights, though. Fantoon and the Golden Chorizo don't like super missiles at all, and are quick to punish you for daring to use them. The Speed Booster, and its corollary move the Shine Spark, are perhaps the flashiest addition to Samus's moveset, this game's equivalent of the Screw Attack from Metroid and the Space Jump from Metroid 2. Like the Space Jump, the Speed Booster totally changes the way you approach certain rooms, and is used to access some truly diabolical hidden upgrades. Fusion and Zero Mission would carry on this tradition proudly, and the only games that have ignored it have been in the Prime series, probably because they would have a lot of headaches implementing it in 3D. Imagine trying to locate one little corner of a wall to speed boost through in Prime's giant rooms. It would be an absolute nightmare. What did appear in the Prime trilogy was the gravity suit, which gives Samus the same movement underwater that she normally has. Obviously an upgrade that couldn't exist before the introduction of underwater levels. As well as the grapple beam, the only non-attack beam in the game, which lets her hang and swing from special magnetic blocks. And one more thing, the hyper beam, which Samus uses against Mother Brain in the finale. It has no function outside this one fight, and you barely use it, but it is a named upgrade that shares its name with similarly devastating power-ups in Metroid Prime and Metroid Dread. Yes, I know that the one in Prime is made of Phazon, and the one in Dread is made of concentrated Metroid rage or some crap, but I'm counting this thing as a legacy item anyway. I'm glad to have finally reached a general design section where I didn't accidentally cover everything in advance, and there's a lot to talk about here, so buckle up. Super Metroid's most influential innovation in general design terms was its map, and by that I don't just mean how its rooms are arranged, I mean the literal visual map you see when you pause the game, as well as the mini-map constantly displayed in the top right corner. In-game maps were a feature found in some Western-style RPGs during the late 80s, but it was a concept mostly foreign to Nintendo until around the time of Super Metroid. The original Legend of Zelda had one, or several rather, to help guide you through dungeons, but these were pretty simple affairs. Curiously, Zelda 2 did away with these maps, despite being much more like Western RPGs than the previous game, but they returned in A Link to the Past, which may have been the model for Super Metroid's map screen. The difference is that here the map covers everything, with no distinction between dungeon and overworld rooms. And also, I think it's a little more elegant. It's better suited to how exploration works in Metroid than A Link to the Past's maps were for Zelda. And the mini-map is a useful reminder that helps to keep a massive number of landmarks fresh in your mind as you explore. Also important is the upgrade portion of the pause screen, referred to by the game's designers as the Samus screen. Here you can see all of Samus's upgrades, and more importantly, toggle most of them on or off. You don't have much of a reason to do this with movement upgrades, unless you're attempting some kind of challenge run, but it's beneficial in sorting out one new design wrinkle, the fact that beam upgrades now stack instead of replacing each other. If you get all the upgrades, you now have a beam that freezes enemies, shoots through walls, and fans out, in addition to being super powerful, and that can cause problems. For instance, in order to freeze an enemy, the ice beam has to keep it alive for at least one shot, while the plasma beam kills most enemies in a single shot. So when you have both, the enemy will freeze first and then be destroyed, meaning that effectively the plasma beam is only half as strong if you have the ice beam equipped. Having the wave beam equipped means your shots go through walls whether or not the walls are real, so if you're searching for secret passages, you'll want it to be unequipped so you can tell the difference. Plus there's the charge beam combos, which are so obscure that I've never used one, but they might be the reason why beam toggles exist in the first place. Charging up a single beam with power bombs equipped enables Samus to summon a bunch of swarming projectiles, like she's the ship from Gradius. One of these is even shown off in the attract mode, which plays when you wait at the title screen. It's the plasma beam combo, which an official Japanese guide from 1994 referred to as the Emerald Splash. Yep, the Emerald Splash. No one can just deflect the Emerald Splash! Whew. I swear to God, watching JoJo is like a curse. You start seeing it pop up everywhere. The aforementioned illusory walls are another concept this game pioneered. Walls that you can walk through date all the way back to Adventure on the Atari 2600, but this was their first appearance in a Metroid game, and the team went wild with them. As the game progresses, realizing you can pass through a barrier that looks solid becomes more and more essential to progress, and by the time you get to Ridley's lair, there are so many walkable walls and other fake-outs that you start second-guessing everything. It's funny to think that one of the most linear parts of Super Metroid is also one of the hardest to navigate just because the one correct path is so hard to identify. It's a very trollish area. Less trollish, but often still frustrating, are Super Metroid's color-coded doors, which require a variety of weapons to breach. The familiar red door takes 5 missiles to open, just like in Metroid, but then you find green doors which take a super missile, and yellow doors which need a power bomb. Personally, I've always liked how this setup channels your exploration and makes wide-open areas feel more digestible. But on the other hand, I can certainly empathize with the people who used up their last power bomb to clear a room full of enemies and run smack into a yellow door with no grinding spots in sight. That's just no fun. So, all these things I've been talking about relate to gameplay and level design, but those aren't the first things a new player would notice. Super Metroid's most immediately enjoyable changes have to do with its aesthetics, the visual design of its world, and a fantastic, atmospheric soundtrack. I've gone on record defending Metroid 2's music as pretty good despite its clanginess, but even I have to admit that Super Metroid's music is far, far better. This stuff doesn't need any defending on my part. It's one of the all-time classic SNES soundtracks, right up there with Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, and of course Plok. Kenji Yamamoto, the third composer in as many games to tackle this series, apparently clicked with his subject right off the bat, and he's been in charge of developing Metroid's signature sound ever since, all the way up to last year's Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. He didn't do Other M, though. That's one of many things wrong with that game. Super Metroid is also just a beautiful experience overall, and I don't mean how well it's put together, I mean how it looks. Yes, it's out there. Yes, it's full of creatures that can only be described as grotesque, but even in their grotesqueness, they look good. I happen to think that this game's visuals have aged extremely well, and that's an indication of strong art design, the kind of care and attention that most games didn't get back then, and don't get now either. Throughout a playthrough of Super Metroid, you can always sense the thought and consideration that was put into every little detail. Thousands of little details, which add up to an incredible virtual world that fits inside a 3MB game cartridge, but which feels as big as a planet. This is a game that a small team really cared about, and worked on for many sleepless nights over the course of years, and it almost couldn't help being one of the greatest games of all time. So you know there's a twist coming, right? That's how Super Metroid works. You get all comfy in your gaming routine, and then it throws a curveball at you that you'd never expect. Well, here's the twist. Super Metroid was the worst-selling Metroid game in the history of the franchise when it came out. Metroid nothing. It was one of the worst-selling Nintendo games, period, when it came out. It only managed to sell 1.42 million copies, meaning it moved less plastic than F-Zero, Pilot Wings, Mario Paint, Super Puyo Puyo, SimCity, Disney's Aladdin, Mortal Kombat 2, a game which most people bought on the Genesis anyway, Romancing Saga 2, Super Scope 6, and Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden. That is some pathetic sales performance, and it demands an explanation. One idea which I've seen bandied about is that Super Metroid came out too late in the SNES's lifespan to benefit from the hype, with the PlayStation on the horizon and people losing interest in Nintendo's output. With all due respect to my distinguished game analysis colleagues, that interpretation is complete and utter tosh. The PlayStation got off to a very slow start. Its first bestseller was Ridge Racer, which sold almost exactly the same number of copies as Super Metroid. It didn't have a hit on Nintendo's level until 1996, with the release of Resident Evil. Meanwhile, Nintendo's hit factory wasn't even slowing down yet. Yoshi's Island was released more than a year after Super Metroid, and it topped 4 million copies. Donkey Kong Country 3 came out after Resident Evil, and it managed 3.5 million, even though its protagonists were Diddy Kong's girlfriend and a freaking footy pajama-wearing baby monkey. It's true that 1994 specifically was not a very good year for the Super Nintendo, but that's mostly because Nintendo didn't put out many of its own games that year other than Super Metroid, and third-party games almost always sold considerably worse. They were counting on Super Metroid to carry the year for them, and it flopped. Instead, the holiday season was saved by Rare's Donkey Kong Country, and Nintendo's best-selling game of the year turned out to be Wario Land for the Game Boy, the project that Hiroji Kiyotake had left Metroid behind to work on. So, what did this game do wrong? Frankly, I don't think it did do anything wrong, not from an artistic standpoint. It really hurts to say this, but I think the reason that Super Metroid sold so poorly is just that it was too difficult, too confusing, and too uncompromising to be widely popular in 1994. Metroid had always been a tough series. It was Nintendo hard, the kind of difficult that makes you grit your teeth, dig grooves into the controller with your thumb, and wonder why you play video games in the first place. There's so many secrets, so many things you can miss if you're not really paying attention. And unlike modern sandbox-style games, most of the secrets are mandatory if you want to win. Super Metroid doesn't just invite you to engage with its systems, it demands engagement. And you'd be surprised how many people are turned off by that approach to game design. My guess is that the first group of Japanese and American gamers picked up Super Metroid, and a lot of them got lost right away and struggled to keep up with the difficulty curve. The Noob Bridge in Brinstar has filtered a lot of novice Metroid players. So has Spore Spawn, the first mini-boss in the game, and an incredibly frustrating first mini-boss. In fact, basically every boss and mini-boss encounter in this game is hard, with the possible exception of Crocomire, and that's only if you figure out his gimmick early. When these early adopters bounced off of Super Metroid, word of mouth probably got around that the game was annoying to play and not rewarding. This led to a vicious circle, where fewer people were buying the game, so it had less of a chance to impress new players, and the original crop of disaffected customers would have an outsized influence on its potential sales. Every confusing roadblock was another bailing out point for a new cohort of players. Meridia alone probably weeded out a quarter of them. Another thing many people forget is that renting games was very popular in 1994. Super Metroid features a big world, but it's short by design. If you did know what you were doing, you could beat it in an afternoon, and a weekend would be more than enough time for a smart newbie. It's almost a perfect rental, which made it a less than perfect purchase. And on top of all this, Nintendo was highly dependent on its home market for sales in the mid-90s, and Japanese gamers have never liked Metroid. You can blame it on sexism, or the series feeling too Western, or the phases of the moon if you like. It's just a fact of life that Metroid has never been a hit in Japan, and it probably never will be. When Metroid Dread sold more than 100,000 copies in Japan, that was trumpeted all over the internet as a real breakthrough. For reference, 100,000 copies is around 3% of Dread's total sales. Meanwhile, Japanese gamers account for nearly 25% of the Switch's console sales. R&D 1, Team Shikamaru, and the Deer Force had done their best, but the power of Japanese consumer apathy was simply too great to be overcome by such feeble weapons as hard work and artistic genius. Nintendo's president did put a high price on the work of R&D 1. After all, these were the creators of the blockbuster Game Boy, led by Gunpei Yokoi, the brilliant toy maker who had kept the whole company from going under more than once. He appreciated what they'd done in the old days, but those days were over, and he couldn't fund a losing proposition forever. And so the Metroid series fell into a prolonged slumber, a period of 6 years during which there were no Metroid games in development or any plans for new Metroid games. Samus would show up from time to time as a cameo, and memorably as a fighter in the original Super Smash Bros., but her own series was on ice, maybe for good as far as any American gamers were aware. Most of the Super Metroid team would move on to producing the, in retrospect, even more doomed Virtual Boy. R&D 1's only remaining hit series now was Wario Land, and even that was only relative. Wario Land 2, which took 4 years to come out after the original, sold even worse than Super Metroid, and Wario Land 3 was only a little better. While Samus slept, Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo after 30 years of service and tragically lost his life in a car crash the next year. Yoshio Sakamoto went back to being a nobody, working on minor games and hardware projects like the Game Boy camera. Makoto Kano's career essentially ended, and Toru Osawa moved over to Nintendo EAD to become one of the directors of a little game you may have heard of called The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. One Nintendo employee, more than anyone else, was responsible for shaking Metroid out of this self-imposed sleep and giving it a sense of purpose again. He had not been known previously for his work on Metroid. Actually, as far as anyone knew, he didn't even like Metroid. But he was known for encouraging others to make the best use of the assets they had on hand, and not let grass grow under their feet, an approach he was best known for applying to the Zelda series. That man, who did more than anyone else to revitalize Metroid, whether he intended to or not, was named Shigeru Miyamoto.